Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We are back with Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. Going on to episode number 5 today, The Acolytes, Yugoslavia, and China.
Yeah, we've seen how the ideas of Marx started in Germany, but really took root in Russia and what became the Soviet Union. Marxism is a universalist ideology. The plan is to spread Marxism or communism all across the world and unite all of the workers of the world in the ownership of the means of production, to have governments that are equal everywhere, and it requires a single world state. That hasn't happened, thank God. But in this episode, we look at the places where communism did take root outside of the main core of the Soviet Union, versus Yugoslavia, which one of our scholars has direct personal experience with, and then, of course, China, which is the leading communist regime at the time that this podcast is being recorded in 2025.
You know, this one time I remember I saw this T-shirt that said, "Communism, always one murder away from utopia." And this is exactly, I think, what happens with communism, that they're always trying to pursue this utopia. They claim that, well, communism hasn't really been tried. You know, we have the example of Soviet Union. Well, that was an actual communism. And then it spreads to other places. Well, that isn't exactly communism. And it continues to spread, and it continues to fail, and it continues to spread misery around the world.
Yeah, and these two places, Yugoslavia and China, are examples of places where communism has seemed to work to some extent. But what we find out is that Yugoslavia's success was all fake and illusory. Right. It depended upon substantial Western financial, which means substantial capitalist support. And when Tito, their leader, died, that support dried up and Yugoslavia became a disaster. In a similar vein, China's continued durability as a communist regime has depended largely on them making concessions towards the direction of free market principles and capitalism. Limited, to be sure, but they are certainly not strict adherents to the doctrines of Marx, and our scholars make that clear in this course.
From the audio, you can already tell that this is a very well-produced course and beautiful. I really encourage you to watch it, and we actually have Blu-rays available of the course. If you'd like to support Hillsdale College, the work we do here, and spreading more free online courses for people to learn these ideas that are important, I encourage you to go to hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course. And with a donation of $100 or more to support our cause, you can get a copy of the Blu-ray.
With that, let's turn to episode 5 of Marxism, Socialism, and Communism, The Acolytes, Yugoslavia and China.
With the fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the truth about conditions within the country became undeniable. Marx's vision of a classless society had failed. Instead of prosperity and equality, communism in the Soviet Union had produced the largest death toll of any human undertaking in history. But despite the collapse of its most prominent laboratory, communism as an ideology was far from over. In fact, because of the Soviet Union's successful propaganda over the previous decades, communism was on the verge of its most vigorous expansion yet.
The appearance of what had happened in the Soviet Union gave hope in these less developed countries that they could rapidly modernize. The Soviets had taken over a largely agricultural economy and had very rapidly modernized it at terrible cost, with lots of economic problems that were hidden, though, if you're in these less developed countries.
Communism spread into other nations with the help of Soviet funding and training, accelerated by Stalin's conquest and victory in World War II. As it became entrenched in other nations, it had the same result there as in the USSR. Flagrant injustice, unimaginable atrocities, and catastrophic economic collapse.
So Stalin died in 1953, and the legacy that he left behind was a horrific one. And even the Soviet Republic actually had to contend with that. So when Khrushchev emerged as the next leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he in fact was willing to deal with the atrocities that were committed under Stalin.
It did signal that maybe the longhorns and fangs that had characterized Stalin's regime were going to disappear, although the secret police apparatus was still retained under Khrushchev, and the suspicion of Soviet territorial ambitions in terms of undermining Western democracies and turning them into communist regimes, all that remained. So the Cold War barely missed a beat once Stalin died and Khrushchev emerged.
Communism spread by the sword to Eastern Europe as well as China in the wake of the Second World War. None of these regimes ever had a huge amount of popular purchase. A country such as East Germany was much less prosperous than West Germany on any possible available metric. That didn't necessarily mean all of the people were unhappy. It didn't mean that communism fulfilled their needs. Rather, in the absence of other distractions and not knowing, it was only once they knew how much more prosperous people were in West Germany. That's what made them unhappy. So long as they didn't know, perhaps they were happy in their ignorance.
Eastern European economies were socialist economies, just as the Soviet Union economy was. These socialist economies were under the control of the communist parties of each country.
They weren't prosperous exactly, but their lives were simpler. When I would meet Russians, Eastern Europeans too, but particularly Russians in the 1990s, a generational gap that you would often notice is that younger people who had not fully grown up under communism, or perhaps who had grown up under the era after communism, they were obviously a bit more westernized in their sensibilities. They were also willing to work harder, go to work for Western companies where you were actually expected to put in a long day at work. And you wouldn't have the all-union smoke break at 11 a.m. Everyone wouldn't be drunk on the tractor combine in the farms. Some people preferred that kind of life. You didn't really have to think very hard. You didn't have to work very hard.
At endless rallies, they proclaim it. Peace, peace. A great and a beautiful word, peace.
I grew up in Yugoslavia, a country which no longer exists. It came apart in the early 90s during the brutal civil war. It initially started after the end of World War II, being under the dominance of Stalin and adopting a Stalinist economic system. The Communist Party in Yugoslavia was led by so-called Marshal Tito.
The Yugoslav Communist Party, led by Tito, resisted being simply a client of Moscow. And he sort of positioned himself between the West and the Soviet Union.
Tito, in fact, gradually started diminishing the government control over the society, to the point that in the mid-60s, he said, listen, people can leave Yugoslavia freely. So there was an emigration of a lot of people that started sending back a lot of money, which is what Tito wanted. And he instituted a very interesting system of socialism that he referred to as worker self-management. So he said, rather than central planning, we're going to have workers, through democratic means, decide how these factories are going to be run. And that caught the imagination of a lot of Western intellectuals. They started latching onto the Yugoslav experiment, and they started saying, this is the better way forward for socialism. Tito was a great hero to many on the left in the Western world. He died in 1980, and Yugoslavia just started collapsing immediately.
On the surface, their economy seemed to do quite well. That was unfortunately a house of cards which collapsed and collapsed hard.
It turned out that the reason why Yugoslavia actually looked pretty attractive in the 1970s had nothing to do with worker self-management, which was another failure. It didn't work, but rather because we were getting massive amounts of loans from the World Bank and other Western institutions. The International Monetary Fund was giving us a lot of money, and once Tito died, they lost faith that Yugoslavia would be able to stay together, and they started asking for their money back. And by the late 80s, there was one of the worst cases of hyperinflation on record, leading to the total economic collapse and then the collapse of the entire country and entry into a horrific civil war.
With a firm grip on Central and Eastern Europe, the USSR continued attempting to spread communism across the globe. An opportunity arose right on the Soviets' doorstep with the tumultuous rise of Mao Zedong in China.
Traditional China and traditional Chinese beliefs sort of falling apart in the early first decade of the 20th century. China had to decide, what are we going to do now? Well, one of the ideologies that gave answers to this question was Marxism. I think Chinese communism was especially potent because it promised relief to the ordinary peasant, which would be the vast bulk of the Chinese population. Poor people who lived on the land or off of the land, very harsh conditions, and you're promised your life will be better. And the Soviets, in the wake of decolonization and things like that, they spend a lot of time aiding indigenous Marxist movements and bringing elites in those countries to the Soviet Union to train them, to give them a Marxist education and technical education too.
Mao Zedong was the leader of the communist movement within China long before China became a communist nation. And he, like many others in China, were competing with each other for domination.
Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were not particularly successful, at least at first, in making major inroads in China.
China became communist after almost 4 decades of civil war, and this is also mixed in with the Japanese invasion of China, which begins 10 years earlier than our involvement in World War II, for instance, in 1931, and then stepping up again further in 1937. So you have this long period of tremendous upheaval. After World War II, the two main groups in China, the nationalist and the communist, the communists were greatly aggrandized, especially by Soviet victory, which put them very close to China.
The Soviets actually set up a military academy. This is somewhat unusual in China, the so-called Wampo Military Academy, which was actually set up in the early 1920s. A lot of the military officers who would later help to direct and lead the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, which came into its own under Mao and the Chinese Civil War, were actually trained by Soviet military advisors. So the relationship between Mao and his Soviet sponsors is an interesting one. We do know from documentary sources that he was on the Soviet payroll as early as 1921. They bought various train tickets for him and started subsidizing the party. Mao clearly had his own ambitions, his own ideas, his own interpretation of Marxism, but he was absolutely a Soviet client from the earliest days.
Chinese communism has the core of Marxism, but some differences. There's more play for the imagination and will and less of a dependence on science in important Maoist measures. One example of this sort of reliance on the imagination and willfulness in Maoism is the idea that if you plant crops deeper, they'll grow up taller and stronger and you'll have more food, instead of they just don't come up at all because you have to plant them in an appropriate way to get them to work at all. So you have these, very fanciful, imaginative measures, often carried through with great brutality, that end up transforming whole segments of society.
Mao did think of himself as a Marxist-Leninist, or Marxist-Leninist-Stalinist, if you wish. And he said that, described himself that way in his writings.
The target is the Chinese Revolution. The arrow this arrow because we want to hit the target of the Chinese Revolution and of the Revolution of the East.
China was starting from a position of dire poverty. There was hardly any railroads in China. China itself wasn't really a nation to begin with. It was all disparate warlords running around throughout most of the 20th century, killing each other. China was not really a country. Russia was, and that was something the Soviets could build on. So when the Chinese tried to do it, it was even a greater disaster than what it was under the Soviets.
A revolution is not a dinner party or writing an essay or painting a picture or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. To put it bluntly, it is necessary to create terror for a while in every rural area.
A lot of what Mao brought to China, as far as both what we might call macroeconomic policy planning, abolition of private property, confiscation, a lot of this drew on the Soviet tradition. There was also a very specific xenophobic edge to the Chinese purges of the early 1950s. In some ways, it was similar to the anti-foreign elements of the Great Terror in Russia. In China, they made it explicit. They actually built these things called denunciation boxes. They were bright red, so you could denounce someone for being either a foreign sympathizer, an agent of the American imperialists, or perhaps something as simple as a class enemy. And hundreds of thousands of people availed themselves of these denunciation boxes. I've seen different statistics, something like 1.2 million reports of suspected neighbors or family members were filed. Maybe as many as 3 million were arrested or sent off to, in many cases, what were called re-education camps. There was a xenophobic anti-foreign element. There was an element of re-education. There was a systematic element of people being encouraged to denounce their neighbors and family members. At times there were death quotas. They would usually be labeled in terms of percentages. That is not a raw, outright number of people to be executed, but rather a targeted percentage. You were supposed to round up or kill a certain number of people in certain areas. But quite explicitly murderous in very much the same way that the quotas were enforced in the Soviet Union. Now, scarcely had that campaign wound down, then Mao launched the campaign we usually call the Great Leap Forward. As he put it, and they always had phrases to crystallize and define these ideas, China would, quote, walk on 2 legs at once. By that, he meant that she would both industrialize and also mass collectivize agriculture.
To distribute resources evenly will only ruin the Great Leap Forward. There is not enough to eat. People starve to death. It is better to let half the people die so that the other half can eat their fill.
They realized that this would effectively kill lots of people, and they talked quite openly about this. They even talked about things such as per million units of cubic soil moved, how many people will die, and that we will accept that price. Well, long story short, it didn't work very well. As one poor, suffering Chinese worker, and it was kind of conscripted into all of this, said, he said, we tried a great leap, but we broke our bones. Even the Chinese Communist government admitted, I believe in 1988, that something like 20 million people had starved to death, and that was the government estimate. The best estimates now come out somewhere in the mid-40s, that is the mid-40 millions. Perhaps 45 million people died in the span of about 3 or 4 years, roughly between 1958 and 1962.
I'd known about floods, but had been persuaded there was relief. Through the parties concerned, such problems were supposed to be solved. But as our train went through Honan, I saw corpses and people in flight from disaster everywhere. There were half-naked people along the tracks begging for food. The train passengers, mostly party cadre, were moved to pity and threw food out the windows. Groups of people fought over the food. On our way back home through this area, The window shades were ordered drawn, and we weren't permitted to look outside. Afterward, party officials forbade us to talk about what we had seen.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Probably the greatest killer of his own people in all world history is Mao, not Stalin, not Hitler. And those policies that Mao introduced, and then later the Cultural Revolution, where they basically went after anybody who was educated in society and made life hard for them, both of those policies held the Chinese back from developing their economy at all.
Mao's murderous and genocidal reign ended with his death on September 9, 1976. With tens of millions dead and what was left of the Chinese people living in grinding poverty, China was in desperate need of revitalization.
Deng Xiaoping was one of the senior figures in the Chinese Communist Party. He was the highest ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party who was effectively either disowned or briefly denounced by Mao in the course of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or as we call it today, the Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966. Denounced as a capitalist rotor, there were various phrases of abuse that were hurled at dissident or rival communist members. In the long run, this might have helped his reputation. He was rehabilitated, actually, while Mao was still alive in 1974, but was still frequently denounced at meetings of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And this gave him a little bit of a reputation as, if not a skeptic, then something of a maverick. And word of this actually leaked out abroad, and this eventually, I think, worked to his advantage. Once Deng Xiaoping emerged himself as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party later in the 1970s, this reputation for at least some level of independence from orthodox doctrine, I think, served him very well. He realized that for all of the alleged achievements of communism in China, they still left much to be desired in the economic or technological sense, which is not the same as saying that he abandoned the ideals of communism. Rather, he thought that China could learn from Japan and from the West, and particularly from the United States, ideally without paying full price.
There is no fundamental contradiction between socialism and the market economy. The problem is how to develop the productive forces more effectively. Our experience over the years has proved that having a totally planned economy hampers the development of the productive forces. If we combine a planned economy with a market economy, we shall be in a better position to leverage the productive forces and speed up economic growth.
And in this, he succeeded. China, in fact, did not have to make any of the same concessions that countries like the Soviet Union had made in exchange for favorable trade deals and actually getting the most favored nation status. And this launched a long period, really, from 1979 almost up to the present day, when China has benefited tremendously from her access to the U.S. market, her access to various U.S. technologies and patents, and in particular, the ability to copy, reverse engineer, or simply steal patents and intellectual property from the West. Perhaps you might say Mao's mistake was trying to out-Stalin Stalin, to do a version of Stalin's 5-year plans a kind of hypertrophic modernization campaign, which had failed quite brutally and abysmally and led to vast death and destruction and really the impoverishment of China. So as late as the early 1980s, even as Deng Xiaoping's economic experiments were beginning to proceed, China was still a desperately poor country. The aim all along, however, was not to liberalize China, certainly not politically, but to allow her to catch up to the West. While the Western business press was agog with all of the reforms and the apparent liberalization of China in the 1980s, China was also conducting the so-called one-child policy, which led, among other things, to vast numbers of kind of hideous late-term abortions as Chinese people were trying to keep up with the government regulations, not allowing them to have more than one child. This was not a government which was about to forfeit its political prerogatives or its political control.
China was an interesting example because it had started implementing pretty serious market reforms in the 1980s, even in the late 1970s. So we started seeing those substantial reforms that were truly changing the material wealth of the regular people in China. But still, the Chinese people tried to bring an end to the communist rule of China. China, unlike Russia and Eastern European countries, did not hesitate in crushing the uprising.
The key episode as far as the maintenance of Chinese Communist Party control over the country was almost certainly the Tiananmen Square uprising of May and June of 1989, and then its brutal crushing by the People's Liberation Army in early June 1989.
Just absolute slaughter of the protesters. It has allowed the Communist Party of China to remain in control of China to this day.
This was an effective signal to the world that while a certain level of economic experimentation was being encouraged, no political liberalization of any kind was going to be allowed.
On the one hand, in China, you have great changes since the 80s in Chinese economic life, much greater prosperity. On the other hand, you have a fiercely repressive regime. The ordinary experience of life in China is not one of freedom, or even close to it.
Despite that crackdown on at least human rights, they actually continued to free up the economy all through the 90s and into the early part of the 21st century. We saw greater number of people being pulled out of poverty as a result of the market reforms done by China than ever before.
Since Deng Xiaoping, China has emerged as a more serious, I think, economic rival for the United States and the West than was ever really expected. The secret of China's success is not one that I fully understand myself. That is to say, how is it that this rigid totalitarian political structure has been able to coexist with increasing levels of entrepreneurship, market activity, while maintaining ultimate state control over the economy?
Chinese society now is really a corrupt, oligarchic, repressive regime that allows a fair amount of economic activity that has raised the standards of many millions of the lives of Chinese.
Much like the Soviet Union in its heyday, the Chinese Communist Party still runs forced labor camps, effectively slave labor camps, as we might call them. Obviously, there are elements of re-education camps as well, entire people like the Uyghurs, movements such as Falun Gong that have been suppressed, dissidents in places like Hong Kong. the Chinese Communist Party has in many ways perfected not just the art of social surveillance of the population, but also mass repression and exploitation of poorly paid or slave labor in terms of its economy.
Is China still a communist country today? Yes and no. Because yes, officially they call themselves a communist country, a Marxist country, but they always add a caveat or footnote by saying, well, yes, but in a new style and in a Chinese manner and so on.
I don't believe China is a communist country, except insofar as it's run by an organization which calls itself the Communist Party. And Communist Party membership is decisive for being in the leadership, of course, but there's no attempt, I don't think, even a pretense of aiming at bringing about the classless society.
I think we should maybe take the Chinese Communist Party at its word, that whatever it is they're doing, it is still communism. It's just a modified version of communism which they have figured out works. I think in some ways what you can see under Deng Xiaoping and his successors is the efforts of Chinese communists to learn from history, that is, to avoid the most egregious mistakes of people like Stalin and Mao, and instead learn from the aspects of their policies which actually did work. Foreign technology transfer, industrial espionage, opportunistic trade deals, leveraging, that is, every asset that they have in order to maintain party control and party dominance over the Chinese economy, and increasingly, of course, a vast swathe of the global economy.
Now, please join me in a warm applause to welcome the General Secretary and other Political Bureau Standing Committee members.
Xi Jinping is the head of state in China, that is, he's president of the People's Republic of China, and he's also the general secretary of the Communist Party, so effectively he runs both party and state. I think the goal of China today, of any CCP or Communist Party government in China, remains the ultimate reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. That's the primary goal. Whether that happens through war, through some type of blockade, or perhaps even through a kind of voluntary submission, I think is still a matter of uncertainty. But I think this is the primary foreign policy goal of the People's Republic of China. As far as the broader goals domestically, I think to maintain control, obviously to maintain some level of economic growth in order to both pacify and keep the population mostly on board with the government, while maintaining a firmer hand, you might say, on dissidents in any groups such as the Uyghurs who threaten the party's hold on power.
They've actually started bringing larger and larger parts of the economy back under the control of the Communist Party. And of course, they're spreading into attempting to influence the rest of the world. China remains this kind of a socialist economy, though a hybrid.
The most remarkable aspect of the story of communism in China to me is the simple endurance of the Chinese people. Those who endured, who suffered, those who were re-educated, those who were arrested, those who were deported. Obviously, many of them were murdered in cold blood or starved to death. I think it's quite remarkable that the country maintains such a level of vitality and energy today. Of course, we don't know for sure what all of those Chinese people, all those mute victims who suffered or who died, who were killed or murdered in the various purges, the repressions of the Great Leap Forward, of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or the other high-profile episodes of repression in Chinese history. We don't know what they would have thought, or what the dissidents of Tiananmen Square would have thought of today's China. Perhaps we can only wonder what they would have made of today's China and its alleged achievements.
Despite Marxism's repressive and violent history across the USSR, its satellite states, and China, fascination with Marx's writings in the Western world has not declined. In fact, shockingly, Marx's writings seem to be gaining popularity in the affluent, developed West.
Frankly, it's appalling to me how many people today in this country express a preference for socialism, if only we could live under socialism. 35, 40%, I think, in a recent poll.
It has been a very interesting and quite remarkable development that over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen this resurgence of interest in ideas of socialism.
I don't think Marxism is going away anytime soon because he provides such a powerful framework for a large commercial economy.
In the whole story of socialism during the 20th century especially, is first of all to remember that the system collapsed after 75 years in Russia. The system collapsed because at the end of the day, it was just not workable. It's not workable to deprive people of basic freedoms, the freedom to be imaginative, the freedom to live well.
Socialists are constantly trying to find the new version of socialism that's going to work better, and every one of those fails.
Despite communism's unfailing record of devastation and ruin everywhere it has been implemented, history continues to repeat itself. Against all reason and decency, Marxism, socialism, and communism have retained a foothold in the United States, and in some quarters, have grown in popularity and influence.